The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
Fish were dying, birds were dying, and her book was a wake-up call.
An environmental crisis faced President John F. Kennedy when he took office in 1961. Unregulated commercial interests were causing an ecological catastrophe that few were talking about. Thanks to the efforts of a few key activists, including a woman who is credited with founding the modern environmental movement, things began to change starting with President Kennedy's administration. We'll discuss how all that happened and what JFK's environmental legacy looks like 60 years after his administration. Next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to the 10th season of JFK 35. We thank those of you who have been with us since day one and offer a welcome to our new listeners joining us for the first time. Today, we are going to look back at the environmental legacy left behind by President John F. Kennedy and learn about some of the activists behind the scenes who pushed Kennedy to act. In particular, one woman influenced Kennedy's environmental policy decisions more than almost any other administration official. Marine biologist Rachel Carson, credited by many as starting the modern environmental movement, wrote several books on the sea and the amazing plants and animals that call the oceans home. President Kennedy was an avid reader of her books and had them on his bookshelves in Hyannisport. Her best-known work, Silent Spring, was published during Kennedy's presidency in 1962, and unlike her other books, it was a stark warning about the agriculture industry and the widespread use of the pesticide DDT. Joining me now is award-winning author Douglas Brinkley to discuss his new book, Silent Spring Revolution, which discusses Carson's influence and other environmentalists at the time who pushed President Kennedy and later administrations to combat the, quote, mauling of the natural world that had been happening in the previous first half of the 20th century. Doug, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So while there are three presidents named on your book cover, there's a name that people outside the environmental advocacy movement may be less familiar with. Her name is Rachel Carson. Carson wrote the book Silent Spring, which your book draws its name from. I want to start by having you introduce us to Rachel Carson, her book Silent Spring, and why she's such a pivotal actor in what you call the next great environmental awakening.
Well, thank you for having me. Rachel Carson was born in Springdale, Pennsylvania, along the Allegheny River, not far from Pittsburgh. And as a girl, she played in the woods and got very enamored with the natural world. She would collect fossils and do little diaries about animals that she saw in the wild. She went on to go to what today's Chatham and outside of Pittsburgh, a women's school back then. Today it's co-ed. And from there, she decided and had really an epiphany when she went to Woods Hole in Massachusetts, which was the oceanographic center of the universe. If you wanted to study ocean science, you made it to Woods Hole. There were libraries filled with books about marine creatures and the like, and she took to it. And her great genius out of Woods Hole, and then later doing her master's at zoology at Johns Hopkins and becoming a nature columnist writing about fish stocks and the like for the Baltimore Sun. Her real genius was marrying science, marine biology, with beautiful prose. Very few science-minded writers are able to do that. Charles Darwin was able to do that. Henry David Thoreau was able to do that. But the list isn't long. And so she started writing eventually a sea trilogy. The first came out in 1941, and then the last one came out in the late 50s. And these three books on oceans were revelations to people. Even today, this late in the 21st century, nobody has written about the world's oceans and shorelines with the beauty of Rachel Carson. But she got very worried. She joined John F. Kennedy's campaign tangentially, but working on the Democratic Party platform on the environment in 1960. And during that period when JFK was running for president, she was writing her book Silent Spring, which was warning us about DDT, which was sprayed to kill mosquitoes and lice. But we were having prop planes dust over vast agricultural acres and would get into suburban communities, people's backyards, and fish were dying, birds were dying. And her book was a wake-up call for reform, that we have to start having the federal government get rid of these toxic products, that at least ones that haven't been vetted properly. And it sprung the environmental movement because John F. Kennedy backed her action once he got the results of a President's Scientific Advisory Committee that said Rachel Carson was indeed right. And at that point, people realized the environment wasn't about saving just Cape Cod National Seashore like John F. Kennedy did, or Point Reyes National Seashore in California like he did, but it was also about life quality and making sure these chemicals that we were mass producing in America weren't detrimental to people's health or nature writ large.
And, I grew up seeing bottles that say no DDT. Of course, it was her book that sort of shined the light on the dangers. Had that not happened, what was its danger to the environment?
Well, it became seen as a bit of a miracle substance during World War II. For example, when John F. Kennedy went to the Pacific, PT-109 fame and all of that, he and all the other Americans in the military were sprayed with it to make sure they weren't getting malarial conditions or having ticks or lice get them sick. And yet it was during this period, and I write in my book, Silent Spring Revolution, that a public scientist genius named Barry Commoner started recognizing that this spray that did kill mosquitoes, and it did kill ticks, and it also killed fish stocks, birds, and the planet as we know it. And that research took a while to percolate, but Rachel Carson was working during World War II for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She was a U.S. government employee, and she was getting all the raw data out of a place called Pawtuxet in Maryland, where they study wildlife research. Even today, if somebody's worried about our contaminated Boston Harbor, or they're going to get sick swimming in Lake Erie, things are tested a lot at Pawtuxet, the water testing and all. We probably all take it for granted that we can turn on a faucet and drink clean water, or that we just flush a toilet and it goes somewhere and gets processed. This was an era I'm talking about when that didn't happen. There were no sewage treatment plants. There was no stamps of approval on these new chemical products. They were just in use. And at that point in the 50s, Rachel Carson got that information about DDT. And the real case I write about is Marjorie Spock in Long Island. Her brother was the famous baby Dr. Benjamin Spock. And she said, Marjorie, I am an organic farmer. I have vast acreage. I want to keep it vast and organic. And instead, Suffolk County, Long Island, and the USDA were blanket spraying across the croplands, and it drifted, and so no longer could she be an organic farmer. And so she sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And she loses her Supreme Court case. But a great friend of the Kennedy family, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, wrote a biting, stinging dissent. And in that dissent, Douglas he says that you have a right, it should be a birthright to have clean air and clean water, and no state entity can fly over your house and spray things that have not been fully vetted. And hence, DDT was a battle. We call it the DDT Wars. It has hot spots, places like Dartmouth, where all the robins were dying on campus, Princeton. It's DDT that got Ralph Nader into being a consumer activist. DDT cases gave birth to environmental law. A group called the Environmental Defense Fund. Slogan was "Sue the Bastards." And today we take it for granted. Any university you go to, you can major in environmental studies, earth science, environmental law. That's all emerging out of the drama of the DDT wars, which Silent Spring triggered. DDT is finally banned in North America in 1972. It took a decade, and it was during the Nixon administration when the first head of the Environmental Protection Agency, William Ruckelshaus, issued the federal ban, and the Silent Spring Revolution had a big victory.
Yeah, and this relates to kind of how you lay out in your book that prior sort of to this environmental awakening in the 60s, 70s, the atomic age had begun. They had started testing nuclear bombs, and then you've got this rapid industrialization that follows after World War II. And so if you can describe, like, this creates just sort of a host of sort of environmental issues that now are resolving, like DDT and like other things, if you want to go into some of that.
Our chickens came home to roost after World War II because, yes, we won. VE Day, VJ Day, and we were the only country with atomic weapons from 1945 to 1949. But in that Cold War, early Cold War environment, we started testing nuclear weapons left and right. So we would blow up, from 1945 to 1992, the United States blew up 1,054 nuclear devices. And these created the ones that were above air, fallout and radiation sickness. So that was blowing across the land. I mean, when you look at the Kennedy administration era and you hear a song like Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan, they're talking about the radiation fallout. Hard rain's gonna fall. People were getting sick. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King famously said it does no good to integrate a lunch counter in Greensboro if the milk we're drinking is contaminated with radiation. That's the birth of the environmental movement going on. It's about the problems of DDT, nuclear fallout. These were byproducts of the Second World War that helped us win the war. But we were having too much faith in presto, chemical miracles, technology, and while all of those are good and important, we didn't have a vetting device set up, and there were a lot of scientists being bought by the Atomic Energy Commission or a Bureau of Reclamation that wanted to build a dam, or people beholden to the chemical companies. It's a rich business. The extraction industries and chemical industries, meaning oil, gas, merging with chemical, became quite a fist of strength, and all they were about is no federal regulation. And here's Kennedy coming in and backing a woman who's a sea writer, write books on conservation, who did her homework. And Kennedy puts the power of his administration on backing Carson. And the only equivalent thing in American history might be when Harriet Beecher Stowe did Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Lincoln said that this is the woman who got us through the Civil War. The book was that important. Kennedy's embracing of Silent Spring launched the idea that the President of the United States is saying that this nonfiction book is accurate. There are other examples. Theodore Roosevelt read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle about the dirty meatpacking factories, and we could make a nice list of a dozen. But Silent Spring was the one that gave birth. Up till Silent Spring, it's called conservation. After Silent Spring, we call it environment.
Interesting. And also that word protection comes in a lot more after. When did President Kennedy first learn of Carlson's work? You mentioned she wrote these 3 books on the ocean. John F. Kennedy was taught to appreciate the sea. So how did he end up growing up in this sort of early movement and learning about people like Carlson and others?
Well, the credit goes to Rose Kennedy, because she grew up near Concord, Massachusetts, and her hero was Henry David Thoreau. She used to bring her children. John F. Kennedy learned to swim in Walden Pond, not the Atlantic Ocean, not Hyannisport, but at Walden. It was like a baptismal, and some of that tradition still continues in the Kennedy family. But she not only loved Walden, Rose, but loved Thoreau's book called Cape Cod. Her 2 books that she made people read were Thoreau on Cape Cod and Henry Beston's The Outermost House about the Cape. And John F. Kennedy, as you know so well, loved the ocean, swimming, sailing. And after World War II, he adopted seashore preservation as his conservation bailiwick as a U.S. Senator. He was not a very activist senator. He wasn't Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy. But in this particular notion of saving seashores, Kennedy was impressed by a federal government-sponsored book called Our Vanishing Seashores. And William O. Douglas, the Kennedy family friend, Supreme Court Justice, said, Jack, you promise you don't sleep on, you haven't camped enough, you haven't slept on the ground. And Jack Kennedy didn't want to tell my bad back or Addison's disease stories, so it would be I'm a person of the ocean. So I have blue mind. I like sailing. I like being in the breezes, which is true. John F. Kennedy most loved Cape Cod and to Newport, Rhode Island, and then, of course, Florida around Palm Beach. Being on an ocean setting was always preferable to John F. Kennedy. But in the 50s, Carson's books became phenomenal, big hits, and Rose had him read them. And also, Kennedy got very interested in Jacques Cousteau. And Cousteau was doing underwater explorations, doing documentaries about the seas. So one of the unsung stories of John F. Kennedy's presidencies, because it didn't come to fruition, but he was promoting, I wrote my book, American Moonshot, about the space program and the Mercury astronauts, Kennedy. Kennedy was promoting ocean preservation and how to use ocean water for fresh water by converting it and how that would help droughts all over the world, on and on. Kennedy was always deeply interested in all things oceans. Well, Rachel Carson became adopted as one of these auxiliary members of the Kennedy family, like John Kenneth Galbraith or Arthur Schlesinger and the like, not as an intimate advisor, but they knew she was there. And as I mentioned, she was tapped to help the New Frontier develop its environmental plank in 1960. And William O. Douglas was cheerleading for her all the time. And so, there was, she had went to the Kennedy home in Georgetown while John F. Kennedy's running for president to have an evening JFK event with Eleanor Roosevelt and Francis Perkins and Rachel Carson, the ocean writer. She would go to Hickory Hill, Robert F. Kennedy's home, and be there with Stuart Udall and Bill Douglas. Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s fondest childhood memories are Rachel Carson coming there and talking about the ecology and the natural world, and it launched his career as an environmental lawyer. So it was pronounced, but she was not a lobbyist. She was not a talker. In many ways, she was very demure. She was a reader and writer and researcher. But if you wanted to know anything about the oceans, that was who you'd want to ask the question to.
That was his administration expert.
Yeah, and so she's become, today we have Sylvia Earle, who I write about in the book, who was influenced by Rachel Carson and has gone to some of the deepest depths of the ocean to study it, and is a regular hero for National Geographic magazine, and I believe she's even was Time's 100 most important people alive, Sylvia Earle. But before there was Sylvia Earle, there was Rachel Carson on oceans and marine systems. And as anybody knows that lives along the seashores, so with that in mind, Kennedy, one of the first things he did was save Cape Cod National Seashore in 1961, followed by Padre Island National Seashore in Texas, Point Reyes, California. And then Kennedy made a big move of a list that he wanted all of these beachfronts open to the public to avoid private ownership. And these continue after his assassination. On Kennedy's recommendation, the Johnson administration goes forward and creates Fire Island National Seashore in New York, and Cumberland Island gets done in Georgia, and Assateague in Maryland and Virginia, and I could go on and on. We're starting to save our shoreline. And that's John F. Kennedy. That's Kennedy's greatest contributions to the environment, or seashore protection, and the embrace of Rachel Carson, and the choosing of Stuart Udall to be his Interior Secretary. One of the last published pieces of John F. Kennedy before his death was the introduction he wrote to his Interior Secretary's book, The Quiet Crisis, which was about warning that we're doing ecological destruction at such a rapid rate that we're not going to have fresh water, lakes to swim in, rivers, that the city's smog was choking and killing people. And one of the more interesting things in my book is I track John F. Kennedy's Senate career, and lo and behold, I've been able to track obscure places and speeches he makes where he will talk about air quality, water quality being his top concern on a domestic way. Already in the late 50s, it's starting to swirl around that we're losing the natural world integrity of America as an ecosystem.
And, you mentioned Stuart Udall. Let's talk about him for just a minute and who he was, because that's another name that I think today people aren't going to really recognize. But as you said, he did a lot of work in the Kennedy administration and beyond to confront the quiet crisis you just described.
Well, Stuart Udall was from Arizona. His father had been in the Supreme Court of the state. He came from a large Mormon family. And when he became a congressman from Arizona in the 1950s, he bonded with John F. Kennedy. They were close. They both were family men. They both came from large families. They both were exceedingly debonair and handsome. Stuart in a Western-styled way and Kennedy on an Atlantic seaboard way. Easy shorthand between the two. And when John F. Kennedy from Arizona was seen to be in the pocket of a man named Senator Carl Hayden, and Hayden was for Lyndon Johnson to be president in 60, and Arizona was seen as a rubber stamp that whatever Hayden wanted the state would go with. Udall was an upstart young congressman that said, "I'm for Jack Kennedy, not Lyndon Johnson." And Kennedy really appreciated that. And so sure enough, Udall went all over, really nonstop campaigning in the West for Jack Kennedy in 60, and Kennedy rewards him with the Secretary of Interiorship. And it is, the Department of Interior has many different bureaus, divisions. It's the National Park Service, it's U.S. Fish and Wildlife, it's Bureau of Reclamation, that they can administer sometimes wilderness areas, sometimes national monuments. It does a lot. Indian Affairs, as they used to call it, Bureau of Indian Affairs. Udall decided to try to get the new frontier to be Theodore Roosevelt, make conservation the main calling card, and it didn't become that. The Cold War was too heavy with Russia to become the primary issue. But Udall today, that building, the Department of Interior I'm talking about, with all those bureaus, is named after Stuart Udall. He is the great Interior Secretary in U.S. history. In more recent times, his son, Tom Udall, was a senator from New Mexico. Tom Udall now, as I'm talking to you, is our ambassador, Biden's ambassador to New Zealand, just like Caroline Kennedy is with Australia. And they're very close, and it's because both of those two countries, like the United States, really treasures its natural world holdings and things. But Udall was a firebrand, and Kennedy backed his action, and they got a lot done. And so really, there would be no 60s environmental movement without Stuart Udall and John F. Kennedy as tandem team pushing that agenda forward early in the decade.
And it should be noted that faced a lot of backlash for wanting to take a lot of these swaths of land and make them preserves or open to the public. There were commercial interests that wanted these areas that had been untouched, and they, Udall and John F. Kennedy's work, and then after made sure that a lot of these remained the national preserves they were, right?
Yeah, and John F. Kennedy did a nice job of balancing that when he went to the West. The thing about the West is every district wanted a dam. And that meant pork money and jobs, and suddenly $500 million comes to Utah for a bunch of dams. The truth was a lot of these dams weren't needed. And so Kennedy did a good job of, I feel, sorting out projects that needed to be done. One's called the Arkansas Fry Pan, which irrigated the easternmost Colorado, eastern front range of the Rockies down to, with reclamation project. At the same time, Kennedy's saving national monuments in Alabama like Russell Cave, or saving, moving to save the Canyonlands of Utah as a national park, moving to save the North Cascades in Washington State. But yes, that rub is always there between the problem for preservation is what does it mean for a local economy. Another problem on top of that was Eisenhower had something called Mission 66, which was by 1966, we were going to build all these roads and concession stands in our national parks. Udall and Kennedy said, not so fast. Are we sure this is good? I mean, aren't we trying to save the park? Are we trying to make everywhere Disneyland? And the problem was Gatlinburg, Tennessee, where you would be stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and couldn't even move in gridlock. And yet there were ideas to build all these new roads. And so to their credit, Kennedy becomes, and Udall are pushing the Wilderness Act. Huge parts of land, millions of acres where no roads are allowed, no bathrooms, no concession stands, no nothing, just pristine wilderness. And those get tough because, you're in Montana. Why are we putting aside, 1 million acres for bear and raptor habitat instead of development for natural resources? But on the Kennedy effect, Kennedy had it all queued up. He got it through the Senate during his presidency, the Wilderness Act. Almost gets through. Once he gets killed, it finally turns Wayne Aspinall, a congressman from Colorado, to green light it. And in the fall of 1964, Lyndon Johnson signs the Wilderness Act, putting aside 9.1 million acres as roadless wilderness. And that number is grown exponentially.
And I wish we could continue to talk so much, but I want to get a few more things in, a few different topics. And one of them is what some historians have said is the act that saved the world a second time, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It's a different kind of environmental act than what we've been talking about, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the significance that had on the world by making sure that tests for air and sea and on the ground were eliminated.
It was the largest ecological leadership event in U.S. history. John F. Kennedy, following the Cuban Missile Crisis and getting massive amounts of information, he actually would call groups of Women Strike for Peace wanting to ban nuclear testing. Kennedy would call the leaders up and listen to them. He had Norman Cousins of the Saturday Review, who became a special a roving unofficial ambassador for him to negotiate with the Vatican and with Russia, with Khrushchev, on these blowing up of nuclear weapons. Because it wasn't just the United States, but we were blowing up nuclear bombs everywhere. Russia was trying to outtest us, and people were getting sick of cancer, leukemia, on and on. Add to that the fact that the ecological destruction, there's the possible global destruction of humankind if there was a showdown of nuclear weapons in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's for both reasons. John F. Kennedy became determined to ban the testing of nuclear weapons under the atmosphere and underwater. They were allowed to continue to do underground testing. But that limited nuclear test ban treaty, as it's called, between the UK, Russia, and the United States, it's epic. I mean, it was the game changer, and it was the triumph of the anti-nuclear movement of the 1950s. And now Rachel Carson's banning DDT. Don't separate the nuclear test ban treaty from environmental history, because both of those were the leading, and there were 3 environmental movements building in the 50s, 3 lanes: wilderness lobby, saving parkland, species, and the like. That's more Theodore Roosevelt, old style. That was still alive. That was the Wilderness Art of Kennedy and seashore preservation. The second strand's stopping the testing of nuclear weapons and doing arms reductions, but particularly the stopping of the radiation fallout. And the third strand was to ban DDT or other chemicals that were detrimental to the natural environment. Those are the 3 that were subterranean but moving to the front pages in the mid-50s, late 50s. Kennedy seizes on all 3, pushes through the Wilderness Act and the seashore preservation, bans the testing of nuclear weapons and underwater testing, and embraces Rachel Carson to start having federal regulation of all chemicals before they can be used in agriculture. That's Jack Kennedy, and that's a massive environmental legacy that's been obfuscated because scholars that have written on Kennedy don't want to take the time to think about the environment. This last midterm election, we all talk about climate change, but when you came to the midterms, it fell like 8th on the list of voter concerns. That's what it was like when Kennedy had to do all this. It wasn't the concern. It was eighth, but he elevated up. And now when we look at his legacy this many years later, things like going to the moonshot, and Kennedy's New Frontier conservation environmental efforts are some of his most notable achievements.
And, you segued directly into like my last issue I want to talk about, which is you said just recently, the world is looking for the next Rachel Carson moment. What do you mean by that? And what do you think needs to happen? Who's the next Rachel Carson?
What I mean by Rachel Carson moment is a smelling salt effect, a wake-up call. You would think we've gotten our comeuppance already. How much acreage of the Pacific Northwest and California do we have to watch burn? I mean, how many more summers are we going to have to deal with drought in the Midwest, with mega floods, with epic hurricanes? Climate change is real. But Al Gore tried to bring us, I thought he'd almost pulled it off with Inconvenient Truth, but then it sank. And now it's become seen as a Democratic issue, and Republicans want nothing to do with climate change. What used to be more bipartisan in the period I'm writing about, 60s and 70s, have been if you're environmentalist, you're Democrat. If you like oil and gas and energy industry, you're Republican. That's unfortunate. We're not going to be able to tackle the things that we need to do as a country when we're looking at something as our land and water and the way we live and the climate crisis, if we're looking at it from a partisan lens. So it's going to need either presidential leadership where they prioritize climate and the environment, or we're just going to be dealing with a bunch of doomsday scenario after doomsday scenario, meaning melting glaciers, Arctic cap, and just bide our time. I don't think the hero of today's climate movement is an individual. I think it is going to become, or the federal government, because of the divide. It's going to be states. And California and Oregon right now have said by 2035, it's going to be illegal to sell a vehicle on fossil fuels in California or in Oregon. Now, that wakes up people. Now you're starting to hit corporate pocketbooks. And if that California way or Pacific Coast way spreads to other states, it will force the end of gasoline, because the automobile manufacturers, Ford Motor, GM, and the rest, they don't mind building vehicles that people buy for the same money that runs on something besides gasoline. It's just taking on the vast energy lobby of oil and gas, and they're always all powerful because winter comes, it's going to be cold in Boston. People are going to want to see energy prices going up or gas prices going up. There's pump anger at the pump. And the thing that hinders us from Earth stewardship is always the economic concern of expensive gasoline, because it's not an easy thing to transition off of. And so there are always going to be profiteers looking to gouge on the oil and gas world to make money. But in our children's lifetime, fossil fuels won't be used in. Someday people will look back and scratch their heads is how we stayed on it, addicted to petroleum for so long.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully not too late.
Hopefully not too late, but Earth has great healing capacities. Nature can heal, and the main thing I tell young people is don't get pessimistic, get out there, and if climate change is too hard, a big issue, and or it depresses you, don't be depressed. Life is too special. Go work to, save a national wildlife refuge, work to clean up a beach, work to save a species in peril. Be engaged, though, on either a federal or global, state, or even your town park way. Don't distance yourself behind your iPhone and computer and tech mechanisms and hide from the natural world, because it's priceless, clean air and clean water, and the gift of a Noah's Ark full of species that we get to share the planet with. And we need to learn to respect the animal kingdom instead of being conquerors or dominant, have a new kind of reverence for life for our fellow creatures.
Well, hopefully it doesn't take multiple Rachel Carsons, and hopefully we can get on track. Doug, thank you for sitting down with us. And again, we really enjoyed your book, Silent Spring Revolution.
Thank you so much.
Take care. As we mentioned earlier, President Kennedy felt a deep connection to the ocean. He spent his formative years sailing off the coasts of Cape Cod and joined the Navy in World War II. In 1956, 4 years before Kennedy took office, the National Park Service issued a report called Our Vanishing Shorelines. The report warned that without action by the federal government to curtail private development, much of the country's seashores would be inaccessible for public use. The report recommended the government use its authority to acquire portions of the country's shorelines in the interest of public use before these natural coastlines would be completely overtaken by private developers. While the Eisenhower administration opposed the report's recommendation to have the federal government acquire the land, President Kennedy took up the cause. Today, there are 10 national seashores in the United States, and 3 of them were established by President Kennedy: Port Reyes in California, Padre Island in Texas, and Cape Cod in the president's home state of Massachusetts. Today, we are revisiting a segment with Brian Carlstrom, superintendent of the Cape Cod National Seashore. Here is that segment from 2021 right now. And I'm privileged to be joined by Brian Carlstrom, superintendent of the Cape Cod National Seashore. Brian, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Matt. Looking forward to our conversation about Kennedy and his role at the Cape Cod National Seashore, the home of the Wampanoag people, who are the people of the first light.
We are excited to have you. So to begin right now, can you tell us about the history behind the decision to make the Cape Cod beaches a national seashore?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating history. Back in the 50s, many people were growing concerned about development starting to encroach on the outer Cape, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy, as a senator at that time and having had a home in Hyannis, was very interested in helping to preserve the outer Cape and its ambience, and helped with some of the legislation as he was in his role as a U.S. senator. And then when he became president, it actually became a national seashore, the first one under his signature, along with 2 other national seashores, Point Reyes out in California near San Francisco, and Padre Island down on the Gulf shores of Texas. And Cape Cod really is a unique model in terms of National Park Service sites, in that it was the first one that was carved out of 6 towns that were already developed. So it was done in a highly collaborative manner, and it helped to preserve the ambience of the outer Cape, which is a very unique thing to be defined as part of the enabling legislation for any unit of the National Park System. One of the things Kennedy said, I think, is very applicable here, and it's national parks and reserves are an integral aspect of intelligent use of natural resources. It is the course of wisdom to set aside an ample portion of our natural resources as national parks and reserves, thus ensuring that future generations may know the majesty of the earth as we know it today.
Now, you mentioned in your opening that it's also the land of the Mashpee, or the Wampanoags, the Native Americans who were here before any
Yes.
colonists came here. Could you want to tell me a little bit about that history?
Yeah, it's a very rich history going back at least 9,000 years. You know, they were on the land and respected it and were excellent stewards of it throughout that entire history. There are many archaeological sites and sites that are still of great significance to the Wampanoag people throughout Cape Cod National Seashore. We interpret what their presence was and where they were at our visitor center. At the Fort Hill Nature Trails, we have one of their sharpening stones that they use to sharpen tools and weapons and hunting gear for thousands of years that we share with visitors and are happy to interact with them. And in non-COVID times, we have an annual Wampanoag Native American Festival in June. We hope to have that coming back in the summer of 22.
I think that America's history, is not quite perfect when it comes to Native American relations. Has that grown since the seashore was made? And especially with the significance now that the Secretary of Interior for the first time is a Native American origin, have you guys grown in that relationship since this started?
Oh yeah, I think we've got a really strong relationship with the Wampanoag people, both the Aquinnah and the Mashpee tribes, and interact with them, with their tribal historic preservation officers and with their tribal councils and with their youth. We've had interactions with our fire program out here on Cape Cod. We've also working to have we hope, COVID allowing, 4 Wampanoag tribal members as interns for science and communications and education working with us this summer.
You mentioned that this was done during President Kennedy's tenure as president. What was the situation along beaches, as far as development? You mentioned that people were concerned about overdevelopment. What was the situation there, and how had Kennedy's decision to protect Cape Cod affected the coastline?
If you look around the coastline of Massachusetts and other areas along the Atlantic, much of it is developed. And Kennedy loved the outer Cape and the beaches and the nearshore environment and sailing around it. And he and many others recognized that that was starting to slip away. And if they didn't do something back in the 50s and 60s, as the idea was forming and ultimately was approved in 61, that might be lost forever. So they knew that it was a point in time where it needed to be preserved. And if it wasn't done, it would never be available again. And that ambience and that natural environment and the wildness of the outer Cape would slip away to development and private interests. And they wanted to make sure that it was maintained for public enjoyment as a national seashore.
And, the Cape in Massachusetts is obviously a very unique landmass. What makes it unique as far as the animals and plants that call the area home?
There's a lot in that question, Matt. Let me unwrap it a little bit.
That's fine.
I'll start with the glacial process that established the Cape. Basically, the Cape is part of a moraine deposit of gravel and numerous sized rocks and sand from the lobes of glaciation. There were a couple different campaigns that created it, but what the end result is that we have now is what's considered by many to be the longest glaciated peninsula in the world. We have 40 miles of uninterrupted coastline with wild coastal geomorphological processes occurring on a daily basis that at times can be quite spectacular. Annual shoreline erosion on the outer Cape, we know from over a century's worth of very intense scientific measurement, is about 3 feet. But in any one storm event, that can instantly be 60 feet or more. And those are erosion hotspots that happen on a regular basis that aren't necessarily random. And with that rich history of data that we have in the transects along the entire coastline, we understand how the sand is moving and how the erosion is occurring fairly well. And that has created a unique environment for a whole host of animal species. At the seashore, we've got over 570 species of animals that occupy the marine environment, the nearshore environment, the coastal dune environment, the heathlands, then the pitch pine forests, the ponds, the salt marshes, and the upland forest. So it's a very rich, ecologically diverse area that we're here to help preserve as well. And we have a lot of long-term ecological monitoring effort going on in and around all of those different environments.
What would happen to the rest of the state if the state lost this ecosystem?
Well, from a state perspective, and specifically for Cape Cod, Greater Cape Cod, the seashore really serves as a tourist destination and a vacation wonderland. And it's also a very critical piece of the local economy. We attract around 4 million visitors a year. Last year it was 4.1 million. And it really is an economic engine from tourism that fuels a lot of what happens on the Cape. And we're happy to be a part of that. And I think if the seashore were to go away, that would change forever. The natural environment and the fact that we have over 40 miles of natural beaches, like the background behind me here at Coast Guard, is what draws people to the Cape, is to experience that, to immerse themselves in that wildness, to have that experience on the beach, on the ocean, where they can recreate, enjoy themselves, reconnect with nature. A lot of different things you can do for that. Beach combing, walking on the beach, fishing, the different water sports. There's also a lot of experiences with hiking and kayaking and paddle sports. Bicycling is another huge activity in the seashore. Some of the first bicycle trails in the National Park Service are right here at Cape Cod National Seashore.
We think about the pictures that come every season of the whales sort of returning to the Cape area. Is the National
Yes.
Seashore a big reason why those animals continue to be able to come back and enjoy the waters of the area?
We definitely contribute to the water quality, though that's overall it's a pretty small portion in terms of the landmass the seashore has, with about 44,000 acres.
Mm-hmm.
But whale watching and interpreting the return of the whales to Cape Cod Bay with the right whales as they're coming in right now, and the humpbacks as they return through the summer, we definitely help to interpret why the whales are here, how important they are to the marine ecosystems, what their migration patterns are. And it's pretty cool. I mean, you can see whales and observe whales from the shore of Cape Cod, specifically out at Race Point Beach, and then also at Herring Cove near Provincetown.
Now, there are two sort of events happening right now on the planet, one long-term, one short-term, that I assume is affecting you at the Cape Cod Seashore. The short-term one being the pandemic. We hear all over the country that the lack of people and places have sort of created sort of a renaissance for animals coming back to places they haven't seen in forever. What has that been like at the Cape Cod National Seashore?
We haven't seen so much of that. Last summer, we had 4.1 million visitors, which was actually up slightly from the previous year.
Okay.
I think we're within, a reasonable drive from Boston, and all of our beaches have remained open throughout the entire pandemic ordeal as an opportunity for folks to come out and enjoy and reconnect. And, that's been an honor to be able to provide that kind of a experience for people through this pandemic, just to get a break from all the constraints and stress that creates.
That's great. And I said, I think we talked about, I took advantage of that last summer as well.
Yeah. I manage the seashore, but I play there too.
The long-term issue going on is obviously climate change, and the changes in the environment. How have you seen that affect, there have been effects at the seashore?
Yeah, the climate change is undeniably affecting the seashore. We're seeing some temperature shifts in our ponds and changes in terms of how the algae bloom, and some of that is toxic that we watch closely with our partners with the states and the towns. We have some long-term ecological monitoring stations within the seashore. We have been monitoring wave energy that's coming into the seashore and the waves that come in, and we know that the intensity of the overall wave energy that the seashore is experiencing is increasing a little bit, because as sea level rise continues, there are many parts of it that continue to be understood further. And we do know that more wave energy from the big massive storm systems now clears the Georges Bank, and that means the next thing that it encounters is Cape Cod. So from a long-term perspective, we know that's changing the rate of erosion in some areas with greater intensity, but we're still learning more about that every day. We don't have any conclusive information on that necessarily, but we are planning for and doing things in response to sea level rise and what the models show, so that we continue to provide incredible access to our beaches. We've developed an adaptive model where we retreat and rebuild those facilities, and we do it in a sustainable fashion so that they can in fact be relocated, so we're not continually rebuilding the entire structures.
Are you worried, if the country and the world doesn't act, that the Cape Cod National Seashore could be much smaller 50 years from now?
It's a coastal environment. It's forever shrinking. That's a fact. Georges Bank used to be a terrestrial environment. That's kind of this is geologic timescale we're talking of. Cape Cod's next. As sea level rises, it is a concern. It's part of the natural processes. And it's absolutely a concern for us. We know the rate of change in terms of what's happening with our climate is unprecedented. There's a great body of scientific evidence that supports that. We work closely with the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program that's national, that helps us to understand our vulnerability, and we make decisions based on that science. That's part of my job, is to be a responsible steward and to set an example for how that can be done in the most compatible way possible, while taking into account how we responsibly spend the taxpayers' dollars to maintain those access and all those assets that are at greater risk.
We've talked a lot about people coming to enjoy the Capes, to enjoy its beaches, but there's a large education component to National Park Services.
Absolutely.
What do you try to teach people, young, old, middle-aged, as they come into your education programs, whether it's taking a walking tour or, listening to a national park ranger talk?
Our goal is to provide information to our visitors through sharing sound science and information, to provide hopefully a little bit of inspiration or connection, or a little bit of fuel to stimulate their curiosity and maybe their intellectual pursuits. And we do that in a number of different ways. We kind of have a menu, if you will, of services that we provide through social media, through our ranger talks, through our educational programs. We've had interaction with several generations of fourth graders on the seashore and high school students, and they come back to us and just share how enriching those experiences were. We've provided ranger programs that interpret tidal marshes, the Atlantic White Cedar Swamp, the other different environments throughout the seashore. It's really a moving experience to be out there with school-age kids and seeing the rangers do their work through interpretation to help them better understand the natural world we live in and to make a personal connection to it.
This episode will air on Earth Day, a day set aside to reflect on preserving the environment and being good stewards. What would you say is the most important, or some of the most important things to reflect this Earth Day?
This Earth Day is one that's very different, given the state of the world coming through a global pandemic. And I think it's a kind of a unique opportunity for people to really consider how fortunate we are living in the United States to have resources available to us, such as Cape Cod National Seashore, where you can go out and experience the earth and all it has to offer on its own terms. And there's so many things you can do to be a responsible steward as a citizen of the United States, as a responsible steward for Cape Cod National Seashore. We need you to recognize that the seashore is yours. It exists because it was created through the actions of President Kennedy and his brother Ted Kennedy, and so many carrying it forward, and the work that's happening through restoration projects like the Herring River. Go out, choose a way to, on your own terms, that you can connect. If you want to go pick up some trash along the beach on your own, do so. If you want to go for a nature hike, do that. Get out and enjoy the seashore. It's yours to enjoy. It's something that is an intrinsically American value that is many consider our best idea that we've given to the world. And let's make sure it's going to be there so we can continue giving these best examples of what America has to offer. And, if I can close this out, I'd like to offer one more thing that is very poignant, that is in our visitor center at Salt Pond in Eastham that President Kennedy said. And that's, it's a popular quote, but it's one that's so important and relevant to the seashore. And that is, we are tied to the ocean. And when we go back to the sea, we are going back from whence we came. John F. Kennedy.
I think that's an amazing final thought. Do you believe, that we have lived up to those values of protecting the ocean?
I think we're doing better. We continue. Life's a journey. You learn from the past, apply those lessons to the future, and hope that you're making a difference along the way. And the ocean is something that we're just beginning to really, truly understand. And it's amazing to see truly how little marine debris accumulates on Cape Cod compared to other areas around the country that I've seen. And people are growing to respect it. We're developing more collaborative relationships with all the different interests that utilize the ocean. And the seashore is there to help be a steward for that and for the nearshore environment. And we're going to continually work to try and do our best at that. We've come a long way. We got a long way to go.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time. I really look forward to visiting the seashore again this summer.
We look forward to having you, Matt. Make sure to tell all your friends about us. And seashore is yours to enjoy. Come on out and check it.
Climate change and its effects on the environment are the latest challenge facing our leaders today. In December, just over 60 years after President Kennedy's moonshot speech in September 1962, the JFK Library Foundation partnered with Prince William and the Royal Foundation to help host the Earthshot Prize in Boston. During the ceremony, the Royal Foundation awarded £1 million each to 5 projects designed to help combat the effects of climate change and preserve the environment for generations to come. If you are interested in learning more about the Earthshot Prize, you can visit jfklibrary.org/Earthshot Boston. If you are interested in learning more about JFK's environmental legacy, you can visit our podcast page at jfklibrary.org/JFK35. If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet at us at JFKLibrary using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening and have a great day.